Good afternoon. Thank you for joining me. Today we'll be talking about regulations and law enforcement and why they are necessary in order to preserve and protect our public lands. Why regulating our public lands is necessary in order to preserve and protect them for future generations will be our topic today. So let's get started. Laws that were created to regulate public lands help to ensure that the lands are used in a sustainable manner and therefore, again, will be available not only for this generation, but for also future generations to come. Regulation of the land is necessary in order to prevent the overuse and exploitation of its resources, as well as to help in maintaining a sustainable environment. Ensuring that the public is educated on what laws exist and helping them to understand why they are in place is critical. It's so essential in order to help the public to make educated, informed decisions that benefit all entities involved. The focus and purpose of this presentation today is to empower the public to make decisions that help to protect and preserve these precious areas through education and interpretation of the laws that protect the lands rather than just by blind enforcement alone. Today, we will be examining the laws, rules, and regulations that have been put into place in order to protect our public lands, natural resources, and historical sites, and we'll also delve into why they are necessary in order to preserve the areas. So, what is the definition of federally regulated public lands? Federally regulated public lands in the United States are lands in the United States that are held in trust for the American people. That's a very important point to remember. And these areas are managed in large part by one of the following federal agencies. These include the Bureau of Land Management, the United States National Park Service, the Bureau of Reclamation, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as the U.S. Forest Service. So, what is a federal law? Federal laws are regulations that are set forth by the U.S. government that are the cornerstone to protecting our public lands. Let's go over a couple examples of what the most influential federal laws that are currently in place are. We have the Organic Act of 1897. We have the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act of 1960. We also have the National Forest Management Act of 1976, the Lacey Act of 1900, the Antiquities Act of 1906, the Wilderness Act of 1964, and finally, the Federal Land Policy and Management Act of 1976. So what does a lack of government regulation look like? Let us consider the effects on our public lands after our most recent and longest lasting government shutdown in U.S. history, which, by the way, only lasted 35 days. So keep that in the back of your mind as we go forward. Just imagine if we had extended periods of time where these public lands were not regulated. Are laws, policies, and regulations, and the education and interpretation of them to the public necessary in order to preserve and protect our public lands? Let us take a further look into the subject. Let's compare. On one hand, we have what it looks like with government regulations. On this side of things, we have staff that is readily available for park visitors and visitor protection. We have restroom facilities that are open, sanitary, and maintained. We have visitor centers that are operational with staff to assist with interpretive services and information. Roads are open and safe to travel. And then there's also search and rescue services for injured visitors that are available. On the other hand, in comparison, without government regulation, what that looks like is a lack of supervision which results in an irreversible damage, such as vandalism, graffiti, pollution, and ORV scars on the landscape. All of this damage took place in just 35 days, and current scientists and specialists have said that they're irreversible, or in some cases will only be able to be reversed within a matter of 200 to 300 years. We saw an overflow of trash that negatively affected wildlife habitats and ruined efforts to dehabituate wildlife from human food. This resulted in a rise in animal attacks between wildlife and visitors, which is something we work very hard to prevent. We had, unfortunately, a loss of human life due to the fact that there was no rescue services available and staffed at that time, and closed restroom and unsanitary conditions. So why would we want to consider reserving various types of land to be federally managed and owned? Let's take a look into some of the literature that I reviewed. According to Chapter 3, Economic Rationale for Continued Government Ownership of Land, pages 89 through 108 of the Integrated Public Lands Management Principles and Applications to National Forests, Parks, Wildlife Refuges, and BLM lands, states that Congress and the President often have very specific reasons for reserving various types of lands in federal ownership. A couple of these examples include protection of unique scenic and historical resources of the United States that might be lost if lands were developed through the private sector. It's important to preserve or reserve lands for national parks, wildlife refuges, and wilderness areas so as to protect and provide services of natural resources that would not be adequately supplied through private ownership. Recreational visitation, while recognized in the Wilderness Act as a core traditional use of wilderness, is also a principal internal threat to wilderness preservation. What that means in common terms is, whether we like to accept it or not, we as a general public leave a footprint, so to speak, on these lands while visiting them. Recreation visitation to protected natural areas inevitably degrade natural resources intended for protection, creating tension between recreational provisions and resource protection goals, as well as mandates. Vegetation is trampled, soil is eroded, water quality is altered, and wildlife are disturbed, according to Marion Eagleston and Brose, 2016. These impacts occur primarily in locations that receive substantial visitation. So a primary goal of protected area and wilderness management is to limit the aerial extent of visitor impacts and the human footprint of highly disturbed land. Marion Eagleston and Brose, 2016. It is proper to require the federal government to plan for public lands. Land use planning involves many special problems. In other words, we need federal government regulation in order to make this all take place for us. Our public lands also hold considerable untapped mineral resources, including coal, oil, shale, geothermal steam, oil, as well as natural gas, much of which, with careful planning, will help to fill future energy needs. These lands also provide timber for forest products and forage for much of the livestock production, and are perhaps our greatest recreation of natural resources. Further, it is now clear that the federal government will retain ownership of the public lands for the use and enjoyment of future generations. Therefore, we need to plan carefully for the protection and wise use of these resources to balance our recreational, economic, and environmental needs. We can do so through government regulation. It is clear that we need laws like that of the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act of 1960 to help in regulating public lands so that they can be shared, managed, and preserved amongst multiple groups who have their own individual priorities in mind. So how do we educate the general public about the laws that are in place and that they are needed in order to regulate and protect our public lands? One current application being used by a federal agency to ensure the public is educated on the laws that exist and why they are in place are the interpretive programs currently being utilized by the National Park Service. Interpretive programs help visitors to understand and gain appreciation for these unique places, which therefore advances the park's mission of protection. In other words, interpretation allows visitors to see the relevance in the message and importance of the parks they visit. They educate the public and therefore aid in the conservation of park resources through a better understanding and an appreciation of them. Several parks have incorporated this type of education to inform the public about the laws, rules, and regulations that are in place, whose purpose is to keep the visitors as well as the resources protected. To advance this mission, interpretive as well as law enforcement park rangers convey the relevancy and importance of the park's policies, regulations, laws, and rules to the visitors. Interpretive and law enforcement park rangers make it their mission to get the message of the park out to the general public by exploring methods that reach a number of demographics so as to build an active community of park goers for years to come. Some examples of the programs that help get the word out and of which are currently being used by many of the national parks in our area are National History field trips, Cultural Heritage field trips, Environmental Studies programs, Junior Ranger programs like Every Kid in the Park, Parks in Focus, Ranger-led hikes, guided walks, campfire talks, star parties, and so much more. So what do we do? These are future issues and concerns. It's imperative that we continue to educate the public about the laws that are in place so as to empower them to make the right decisions when visiting our public lands. By doing so, we hope to prevent future overuse or exploitation of these lands that are so very precious to our communities, our history, and us as individuals. In order to avoid overuse and exploitation that was seen prior to government regulation and management, we must ensure that all with whom visit our public lands are educated about the laws that are in place specific to that area or resource. We can do so by continuing the example set forth by the National Park Service, using strategies that educate the public like that of the interpretive programs. Through education and awareness, we can preserve and protect our nation's public lands, natural resources, as well as historic sites, unimpaired for this as well as future generations. So why federal regulation of public lands is necessary? Get involved. We won't be able to include this in the presentation, but if you'd like to stay behind, I have a video here that would also give you some visual representation as to why getting involved is so necessary and essential in this topic. Please remember that federal regulation of our public lands is necessary in order to preserve and protect them for this and future generations. Remember to get involved in support of our public lands. Only you can make a difference. Remember, educate yourself about the laws that affect how our public lands are used. And your vote matters. Support decisions that make a difference. Thank you very much for coming and joining me today for this very special presentation. Have a wonderful afternoon.